As we close out August and head into the Labor Day weekend, the cooler than normal stretch continues across most of the country. But don't be fooled, this isn't a sign of early winter just yet. In fact, while the South deals with heavy rain this coming weekend, the long-range maps tied to La Nina hint at something very different. So what does that mean for September and beyond? Let's dig into our forecast. As we look at our Friday morning, we see that trough that has been across the eastern half of the United States. It's continuing to move off to the north and east during this weekend. It's going to take root over here across the New England area for this upcoming weekend, keeping it very cool. We're going to see continued northwesterly flows across the Ohio Valley into the Great Lakes, even making its way into the south, while out west we watch that ridge start to build even farther to the north. And just off the coast, we're watching an area of low pressure, but it's not really going to make much forward progress as we see that ridge building, and yet another lobe of cooler than normal air is going to make its way into the Ohio and Tennessee valleys by the time we get to next week. So let's put our future radar into motion here. As we begin our Friday, we're watching rain across the Gulf. We're watching scattered showers and storms from the Dakotas down through Nebraska. And as we go into our Saturday, remember we have that northwesterly flow. The ridge is out to the west, that hot dome. The storms are going to ride the perimeter of that hot dome. And so that's going to keep storms across the Central Plains, but especially through Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana as we go Saturday, Sunday, and into our Monday, our Labor Day. And even into early next week, we watch storms continue across the southeast. But really, we're not expecting anything in the way of severe storms, as we just have a marginal risk across places like Dallas into Louisiana. We also have a marginal risk in eastern Colorado for our Friday. Elsewhere, it is just a thunderstorm risk across parts of Florida, through the Great Lakes, and out across the west. Our main threat is going to be hail. We could see hailstones 1 to 2 inches in diameter, and we could see isolated strong wind gusts of up to 60 miles per hour possible. But as we look here at our temperature anomaly map, as we've been talking all week, the big story is the temperatures that are 20 to 30 degrees below seasonal norms across the eastern half of the United States. And that's going to continue throughout our weekend, whereas out west we're seeing temperatures 10 to 15 degrees above your seasonal norm all the way into our Labor Day. And just a reminder, what this map is really telling you is there's a lot of numbers on this map. So at a point in time, we see the timer up in the upper left-hand corner. These numbers represent the deviation from the normal temperature for that date at that time for that particular location. So it doesn't mean that, just because an area is in purple that it's going to be bitterly cold, or if it's really in the browns and reds that it's going to be excruciating hot. It's just going to be warmer than normal for that time of the year. So across the central part of the United States, temperatures are now relaxing back into the 80s, especially through the Ohio Valley. Across parts of the Canadian provinces, average highs are in the 50s and 60s. And so when we see 10 to 15 degrees, 20 degrees, that means temperatures there in the 70s and 80s are likely. But as I mentioned, the other big story that we're going to see with that ridge out west, those storms riding around the perimeter of it with that northwesterly flow, we're going to get strong, heavy amounts of rainfall from the Dakotas, but especially through Texas, Louisiana, and then back through Florida. And when we look at some of those rainfall amounts just through our Tuesday morning, we're going to see parts of Florida widespread 1 to 2 inches. Though southern Florida, you could be approaching 3 to 5 inches in those localized amounts. I wouldn't be surprised to see a 6 or an 8 inch amount. If we go across the Gulf, it's not going to be the best weather to be out at the beach for your Labor Day weekend. There will be plenty of dry hours. However, we do expect rainfall to be 1 to 2 inches over this weekend. But back through Louisiana, into central Texas, even into West Texas, into the Panhandle, we're seeing widespread 2 to 4 inches of rain. But we have this narrow corridor right here of these yellows and even these browns. This is where we expect the greatest risk of flooding to occur over the next 72 hours, where we could see some areas receive up to 10 inches of rain by the time we get to Tuesday morning. Across parts of eastern New Mexico, you're going to see rainfall amounts generally under a half of an inch, but any amount of rain is welcome this time of the year. And with all that rainfall, you might be thinking that we're under the influence of some kind of tropical system in the Gulf, as we are on the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina striking New Orleans. But no, the tropics are extremely quiet for this time of the year. The peak of hurricane season is September the 10th, and the only area that the National Hurricane Center is watching over the next 7 days is the potential for a wave to come off the African coast and develop into some kind of tropical system. And even at this point, that's less than a 40% chance of any kind of development happening in the tropics. So it's extremely quiet. I don't expect that this pattern is going to remain so as we make our way into September and into October. And we're going to get to that a little bit later in this video. But I do expect the tropics to get very active after the second half of September. So after we make our way through this holiday weekend, we're going to watch yet another cold front making its way out of Canada down through the Great Lakes by the time we get to our Wednesday. This is going to bring rain for the Ohio and Tennessee valleys, but this cold front is going to pack quite the punch. And as we see that low pressure develop and start to move to the northeast, this is going to be a very powerful system as it makes its way into Canada. And here we watch that storm really ramping up and deepening, and it's going to become a very deep, intense cyclone across the northeast as we get towards next weekend. Elsewhere across the south, we're going to watch for scattered showers. We're going to see continued showers across the Four Corners region, not that monsoon flow or that northwesterly flow that we saw this coming weekend. That activity is going to move a little bit further east into next weekend. But look at this. This is that cool air that we're still seeing across the eastern half of the United States as we begin the month of September. We have the ridge of high pressure off to the west, above normal temperatures for that area, but here comes yet another trough digging down into the Great Lakes and into the Ohio Valley. And by the time we get to Wednesday and Thursday, this is going to be pulling down some of the coldest air that we have seen so far. If you thought this past week was cool, next week as we get to Wednesday, Thursday, for places like Chicago, Indianapolis, Milwaukee, Detroit, you could be struggling to get out of the 50s in some locations. And that cold, cooler air is going to hang around. But as we get to next weekend, it's going to migrate to the north and east, and it's going to set some very cold conditions across the northeast into the Canadian provinces. In fact, when we look at our temperature loop going from Tuesday next week into the following weekend, we see those daytime highs really starting to lower, 30s and 40s for your nighttime lows, but only recovering into the 40s and 50s across parts of western Ontario, and that cooler air starts to sag to the south and east. I would expect that by the time we get to next Wednesday morning, next Thursday morning, we're going to see widespread frost and freeze advisories across parts of northern Minnesota, Wisconsin, and possibly the UP as that core of the cold air locked in to the Great Lakes. We could see mid-low 40s for low temperatures by our Friday morning for places like Springfield, Illinois, and St. Louis, Missouri. And the Climate Prediction Center agrees with our thinking. Here's their 8 to 14-day temperature outlook. And again, most of the eastern half of the United States is expected to be below normal for the period next weekend into the second week of September. The real warm temperatures are going to be across the Pacific Northwest. We need to have that ridge and across the Gulf into Florida. And in terms of our precipitation, most areas of the country are either going to be near, slightly above normal in terms of their likelihood for above normal precipitation, though we're going to see below normal across the lower Ohio Valley as we get to the second week of September. This is all being triggered by a lot of things going on, and as we move into September, especially as we get to October, and the daylight is getting shorter each and every day as the amount of daylight is shortening. One of the things we start to look at is what's going on with the waters in the Pacific. Are we going to have an El Nino winter? So this continues to track. And so right now, as of August 28th, the temperatures in the eastern part of the Pacific are running about 0.8 of a degree centigrade below normal for this time of the year. So right now, anything below half a degree would indicate that we are in a weak La Nina. But right now, this is typical that we start to see these values decline this type of the year. Will they remain so? Will they dip below -1? If so, that's going to be a stronger indication that we could be moving into a La Nina pattern for this upcoming weekend. And if this trend continues, a La Nina indicator also a more active tropics out in the Atlantic, because it reduces the amount of wind shear that is in the Atlantic, which allows those tropical systems to develop, doesn't cut off tops of the storms as they move west off of the African coast. So that's why I believe that as we get into the second half of September, we could see a lot more tropical systems in the Atlantic and a much more active pattern for September and October. But we're going to continue to monitor this, see that trend over the next 2 to 3 weeks. Because right now it is trending in that weak La Nina. Does it stay there or does it start to bounce back up like we saw at the end of July, first part of August? The other map that I haven't shown in quite a while is the 500 millibar anomaly map. Now we have that big one of the United States that I showed earlier in this video. But as we get into this week, this green here, this indicates that area of low pressure, the cooler, the troughiness that we've experienced over the eastern half of the United States. We've seen high pressure into the Gulf of Alaska, eastern Alaska, and the northern Canadian province. As we go into next week, we're going to watch this area of high pressure and the area of high pressure that's on the other side of the North Pole. They're going to kind of come together. And what that's going to do is it's going to continue to push another lobe of cooler than normal air down out of Canada into the lower 48. So that's why we believe as we get toward next weekend, we're going to see another jab of colder than normal temperatures for the eastern half of the United States. But as we get into the middle of September, Mother Nature, she loves to even things out. So where we have those colder than normal temperatures here in the eastern half of the United States, warm out west, as we get into that third week, Mother Nature is going to try to balance things out. So we don't see those deep troughs anymore. It's a general slightly above normal pattern as we get there. But then as we get into the last part of September, we're watching an area, a trough, into the Gulf of Alaska. What that's going to do is it's going to displace that ridge push warmer than normal temperatures across the lower provinces, potentially down to the northern plains and the Great Lakes. So that's why I say, even if we get colder temperatures next week, we are not done with summertime temperatures, as we could see a return to warmer than normal temperatures by the time we get toward the end of September across the eastern half of the United States. So let's go ahead and take a look at our temperatures for our Labor Day weekend. Starting here with our Friday, we're going to see that cool air continue across the eastern half of the United States, 60s and 70s. We have 80s throughout the Central Plains, but where that rainfall is the heaviest, temperatures there will be kept down to 70s, 90s across parts of Texas, and out across the deserts, we're 100 to 105. Not the record-breaking high heat that we saw in July, 115 to 110, but it's definitely warm, and that warmth continues into eastern Washington. For our Saturday, it's much of the same. Where we see those rain showers from the Dakotas down through Oklahoma, temperatures are in the 70s, cool in the northeast, warm along the Gulf, mid-90s for most of Texas, and warm across the western half of the United States. As we go into our Sunday, we're starting to see a little bit of warmth building back into Montana, where we could see high temperatures approaching the low 90s, even into southern Canada. And that is, again, associated with that trough that's building into the northern Canadian provinces. It's going to start to dislodge some of that cooler air into the eastern half of the United States. As we go into our Tuesday, temperatures across parts of Iowa are going to be kept down as we see yet another system making its way out of the northern plains into the Great Lakes. Temperatures here could be kept down due to rainfall and cloud cover. 90s for Texas. We're getting a little bit warmer out in the deserts and into the interior of California, even up into Washington State, triple digits. But again, the eastern half of the United States remains below normal in its temperatures. As we get towards our Wednesday, here comes that cooler air with high temperatures across the northern parts struggling to get into the 60s. Out ahead of it, we may warm into the 80s to near 80 for the Ohio and Tennessee Valley. We'll watch that to see how that develops. By our Thursday, that cooler air is making its way in. Parts of the UP could struggle into the 50s, but look out west. We're approaching 110 in the interior of California. Triple digits for Watch State. Idaho, you could be pushing your triple digits. But out on the East Coast, places like Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, you could be in the mid-60s for your highs next Thursday. Well, we thank you for joining us here at the Weather Farm. As you can tell, it's a very active pattern with cooler than normal temperatures continuing for the next 8 to 14 days across the eastern half of the United States. The tropics are remaining quiet for now, and we look out into the Pacific. What do those sea temperatures tell us about what will happen as we get into the fall and into the upcoming winter pattern? We hope you have a wonderful Labor Day weekend. We will see you again real soon.